Good evening, friends, and welcome back to another peaceful journey through the curious corridors of history. Tonight, we'll drift into the strange and sometimes bewildering world of ancient beliefs, specifically, the 7 most peculiar things our ancestors believed about women. Dim your lights now, settle under your favorite blanket, and let your breathing slow as we explore these fascinating misconceptions together. If this calm journey helps you unwind and guides you toward restful sleep, tap like and subscribe only if it feels right. There's no pressure here. Just an invitation to join our quiet community of history lovers who find peace in the past. Tonight's stories span thousands of years and countless cultures, each revealing how differently our ancestors understood the world around them. Some of these beliefs might seem almost comical now, others surprisingly persistent, but all of them offer us a gentle window into minds very different from our own. So close your eyes if you'd like, or let them grow heavy as we begin our first tale. Let me tell you about one of the most persistent and peculiar medical beliefs that lasted for over 2,000 years, the idea that a woman's womb could simply pack up and wander around her body like a restless traveler seeking better accommodations. Picture, if you will, the soft lamplight flickering in Hippocrates' study around 400 BCE. The father of medicine himself, surrounded by scrolls and the gentle scent of olive oil burning in clay lamps, was contemplating what he considered one of the most serious medical conditions of his time. He called it hysteria, from the Greek word for womb, and believed it explained nearly every ailment that befell women. In this ancient understanding, the womb was not the stable, anchored organ we know today, but rather a creature unto itself, mobile, temperamental, and prone to fits of wandering. Imagine it like a small, dissatisfied pet that might decide the neighborhood of the pelvis was too boring and set off to explore the liver, or perhaps take a scenic route up toward the heart. The ancient physicians described it with the seriousness of modern doctors discussing a displaced vertebra, but with all the whimsy of a fairy tale. The symptoms they attributed to this wandering womb read like a catalog of nearly every human discomfort. Feeling anxious? Your womb had clearly migrated upward and was pressing against your heart. Experiencing shortness of breath? Obviously, the wayward organ had decided to take up residence near your lungs. Headaches, dizziness, loss of appetite, sudden emotional changes? All signs that this internal wanderer had strayed from its proper home. But here's where the story becomes almost touchingly human in its simplicity. The cure, according to these learned men, was to coax the womb back home using scents. Sweet, pleasant aromas placed at the vagina would attract the organ back, while foul smells applied to the nose and mouth would repel it downward. Picture the scene, a patient lying still while her physician waves flowers and herbs near her lower body, and perhaps holds a piece of burnt hair or sulfur near her face. It was like trying to herd a cat using nothing but perfume and the promise of better weather. The Romans inherited this belief from the Greeks, and as they did with most things, made it more elaborate and systematic. Roman physicians like Galen, writing in the 2nd century CE, refined the theory with additional details. They believed the womb could become suffocated if it strayed too far from its blood supply, leading to what they called hysterical suffocation. The treatment expanded to include not just aromatic therapy, but also marriage, because, they reasoned, regular sexual activity would keep the womb properly occupied and less likely to wander. This belief was so deeply ingrained that it shaped not just medical practice, but legal and social structures as well. Women who displayed what we might now recognize as signs of anxiety, depression, or any number of other conditions were often deemed to be suffering from hysteria. Their testimony in court could be dismissed, their behavior excused or controlled, their very rationality questioned, all because learned men believed their wombs were taking unauthorized tours of their torso. The persistence of this belief is perhaps what makes it most remarkable. Long after the Renaissance, when anatomists began to actually dissect human bodies and could clearly see that the womb was firmly anchored in place by ligaments and surrounding tissue, the idea of hysteria caused by a mobile uterus continued to influence medical thought. It wasn't until the late 19th century that this particular medical mythology finally began to fade, replaced by slightly more accurate, if still imperfect, understanding of women's health. What strikes me as almost beautiful about this ancient misconception is how it reveals the very human need to find explanations for the inexplicable. When faced with complex emotional and physical symptoms they couldn't understand, these early physicians created a narrative that felt complete and logical within their worldview. The wandering womb wasn't just medical theory, it was storytelling, an attempt to make sense of the mysterious inner lives of half the human population. In the quiet moments between sleeping and waking, when your own body settles into rest, you might think about those long-ago women, lying still while physicians waved sweet herbs around them, both patient and doctor believing fully in the reality of an organ that could pack its bags and relocate on a whim. There's something oddly comforting about the gentleness of the cure. Flowers and pleasant scents offered with genuine intent to heal, even if the understanding was so far from our modern knowledge. The soft rustling of herbs, the flicker of oil lamps, the murmured consultations between family members and physicians, all of it part of a world where the human body was still largely mysterious, where the difference between the physical and the spiritual was blurrier than we might imagine. These weren't cruel or callous beliefs, but rather the best attempts of their time to understand and help, wrapped in the limitations of their era's knowledge. And perhaps in the drowsy space before sleep, we can find a kind of peace in knowing that the desire to heal, to understand, to offer comfort in the face of suffering has remained constant even as our knowledge has grown. The wandering womb may have been mythical, but the hands that offered healing herbs were real, and the intention to ease suffering was as genuine then as it is now. As your own body settles deeper into rest, let the image fade softly, the ancient physician setting aside his herbs, the patient breathing more easily, the oil lamp burning lower as night deepens. The womb, of course, was exactly where it had always been, but in that long-ago world, the story of its journey seemed to make perfect sense. Now, let your mind drift gently backward through time, to an age when the greatest philosophers and thinkers of the ancient world, men whose ideas still echo through our universities today, sat in marble halls and sun-drenched courtyards, earnestly debating whether women possessed the same capacity for rational thought as men. The answer they reached, with all the confidence of scholars who had never actually asked a woman what she thought, was a resounding no. Picture Aristotle in 4th century BCE Athens, walking slowly through the Lyceum as dappled sunlight filters through olive branches. His footsteps echo softly on stone as he contemplates what he considers a fundamental truth about human nature. In his mind, women are something like incomplete men, beings who failed to develop fully in the womb, resulting in a cooler, moister constitution that made clear thinking nearly impossible. This wasn't considered cruel or dismissive in his time. It was simply natural philosophy, as rigorous and reasoned as his thoughts on physics or ethics. Aristotle believed that the male principle was associated with form, action, and reason, while the female principle represented matter, passivity, and emotion. In his understanding, women provided the material for reproduction, like fertile soil, while men contributed the spark of life and rational soul. It was a cosmic division of labor that seemed to make perfect sense within his philosophical framework. The gentle evening breeze that might have stirred the scrolls in his study carried these ideas far beyond Athens, spreading through the ancient world like seeds on the wind. Roman thinkers embraced and expanded upon these concepts. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, added layers of supposed scientific observation, noting that women's smaller brains surely indicated lesser intellectual capacity. He wrote by candlelight, utterly convinced he was documenting objective truth rather than reflecting the prejudices of his time. But here's what makes this belief particularly fascinating. It existed alongside countless examples of women demonstrating exactly the kind of rational thought these men claimed was impossible. Sappho was composing poetry of mathematical precision and emotional sophistication. Hypatia was teaching mathematics and astronomy in Alexandria. Women were running businesses, managing estates, and making complex decisions that kept households and economies functioning. Yet somehow, this evidence was explained away rather than integrated into their understanding. The learned men developed elaborate theories to account for the disconnect. Women might occasionally display what appeared to be rational behavior, they reasoned. But this was either mimicry of male thought patterns or the result of exceptional circumstances that temporarily overcame their natural limitations. It was rather like modern people watching a dog perform a clever trick, impressive, but not truly changing their fundamental understanding of canine intelligence. Medieval Islamic scholars inherited these Greek ideas and gave them their own interpretations. Al-Jahiz, writing in the 9th century Baghdad, while the call to prayer echoed softly across the city, proposed that women's minds were like gardens that could be cultivated to produce some fruit, but would never match the wild, untamed intellectual forests of masculine reasoning. His metaphors were poetic, his tone gentle, but his conclusions were the same. Christian medieval thinkers wove these beliefs into religious doctrine with particular creativity. Thomas Aquinas, writing by the light of monastery candles in the 13th century, argued that women's supposed intellectual limitations were part of divine plan. They were created to be helpers in procreation, not partners in philosophical contemplation. The soft scratch of his quill on parchment recorded what he saw as theological truth, supported by both Aristotelian logic and biblical interpretation. What's most striking about this ancient belief is how it created its own self-fulfilling prophecy. If you genuinely believe that women cannot engage in rational discourse, you don't invite them to participate in philosophical debates. If you assume they cannot understand complex ideas, you don't teach them mathematics or logic. If you think their minds are fundamentally different and lesser, you create educational and social systems that ensure they have fewer opportunities to demonstrate otherwise. Yet even within these constraints, women found ways to engage their rational minds. They became renowned for their wisdom in areas these same societies valued: managing complex households, negotiating marriages and alliances, preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge through storytelling and oral tradition. They developed sophisticated understanding of herbs and healing, astronomy for agricultural timing, and the intricate social psychology needed to navigate highly restricted lives. The irony, visible to us now in the soft focus of historical distance, is that many of the men who proclaimed women's intellectual inferiority were themselves raised, educated in their earliest years, and often inspired by women. Their mothers, nurses, and female family members were the ones who first taught them language, showed them how to think through problems, and modeled the very rational behaviors these men would later claim were beyond feminine capability. In the quiet hours before dawn, when these ancient philosophers might have set aside their scrolls and prepared for sleep, did any of them ever wonder about the contradiction? Did Aristotle ever pause to consider that his own understanding of logic had been shaped by conversations with his mother? Did the Roman senators ever notice that their wives managed complex social and economic calculations with ease? If they did, those moments of doubt were apparently set aside by morning, filed away like dreams that seem nonsensical in daylight. The persistence of this belief across cultures and centuries reveals something profound about human psychology. Our remarkable ability to maintain theories that contradict daily evidence when those theories serve our existing power structures. It wasn't that ancient men couldn't observe women thinking rationally. It was that acknowledging this observation would have required rebuilding their entire understanding of social order, divine will, and natural law. As you settle deeper into sleep tonight, imagine those long ago women managing their households, raising their children, preserving family stories, making countless decisions, both large and small, all while living in societies that insisted such capabilities were beyond them. There's something almost magical about their resilience, their quiet persistence in being fully human, regardless of what the philosophers proclaimed. The soft whisper of turned pages, the gentle flame of oil lamps burning low, the distant sound of night settling over ancient cities, where half the population was systematically underestimated, it all fades now into the peaceful realm of dreams, where reason and intuition, logic and emotion, male and female wisdom, finally find the harmony that eluded so many brilliant ancient minds.
Let your breathing slow now as we drift into perhaps the most universal and enduring of ancient beliefs about women. The idea that their monthly cycles held mysterious, often dangerous powers that could affect everything from bread rising to metalworking, from weather patterns to the very fabric of reality itself. Close your eyes and imagine the soft pre-dawn light filtering through the windows of a Roman villa in the 1st century CE. Pliny the Elder sits at his writing desk, stylus in hand, carefully documenting what he believes to be crucial scientific observations. The wax tablet before him contains notes about women's menstruation that he considers as factual as his observations about eclipses or volcanic eruptions. In his understanding, menstruating women can turn wine sour with a glance, cause seeds to dry up in the ground, and make iron rust simply by walking past. These weren't casual superstitions whispered by uneducated villagers, but formal medical and scientific theory endorsed by the greatest minds of the ancient world. Pliny wrote with the same methodical care he applied to his natural histories, convinced he was recording objective truth about the mysterious forces emanating from women's bodies. The gentle scratch of his stylus on wax preserved beliefs that would influence Western thought for nearly 2,000 years. Picture the moonlight streaming through the latticed windows of ancient homes as families discussed the practical implications of these beliefs. A woman approaching her monthly time might be asked to avoid the kitchen gardens, lest her presence wilt the growing herbs. She might be discouraged from helping with the bread making, since everyone knew that dough simply wouldn't rise properly under her influence. The wine cellar was definitely off limits. Too many good vintages had reportedly turned to vinegar when women in their monthly cycle ventured too close. But the beliefs extended far beyond simple household management. Ancient texts describe menstrual blood as possessing almost magical properties, simultaneously creative and destructive, life-giving and dangerous. Some cultures believed it could cure leprosy or ward off evil spirits when properly prepared. Others saw it as so contaminating that women needed to be isolated entirely during their cycles, living in separate huts or rooms until the dangerous time had passed. The Jewish tradition of Niddah, the laws of family purity, emerged from this ancient understanding that menstruating women existed in a state of spiritual impurity that could be transmitted through touch. The mikvah, the ritual bath that marked the end of this period, was seen not just as physical cleansing, but as a restoration to normal spiritual status. The soft splash of water in these ancient baths marked the boundary between states of being that were understood as fundamentally different. Hindu traditions developed similar concepts, with the idea that menstruating women possessed a kind of negative energy that could disrupt religious ceremonies and contaminate sacred spaces. Even today, some temples maintain restrictions based on these ancient beliefs. The morning prayers echoing across ancient temple courtyards might pause or change when women in their cycles were present, not from cruelty, but from genuine belief in invisible forces that required careful management. Greek physicians added their own elaborate theories to this growing body of belief. They saw menstruation as proof of women's fundamentally different and unstable nature, evidence that their bodies were constantly in flux, unable to maintain the steady equilibrium that characterized masculine health. The monthly cycle became, in their understanding, a kind of recurring illness that made women temporarily unreliable, emotionally volatile, and physically dangerous to be around.
Medieval European physicians inherited these ideas and expanded them with characteristic thoroughness. They created detailed charts showing how women's mental and physical capabilities supposedly waxed and waned with their cycles, like a human moon, whose influence could be tracked and predicted. Monastery libraries preserved careful treatises on managing households and businesses around women's monthly variations, treating these texts with the same reverence they accorded to theological works. What makes these ancient beliefs particularly poignant is how they transformed a normal biological process into a source of shame, fear, and social restriction. Women learned to hide their cycles, to continue their work while pretending the process wasn't happening, to accept blame for failed bread or soured wine during times when they might have actually needed extra care and rest. Yet within these restrictive beliefs, some ancient cultures found ways to honor the power they attributed to menstruation. The idea that women's monthly cycles connected them to lunar rhythms and cosmic forces, sometimes elevated rather than diminished their status. Some traditions saw menstruating women as temporarily possessing prophetic abilities. Their dreams and insights during this time considered especially significant. The red tent traditions of ancient Middle Eastern cultures created spaces where women could gather during their cycles,
sharing stories and wisdom away from the demands of daily life. Rather than banishment, this became a form of sisterhood, a monthly retreat that honored both the supposed mystical aspects of menstruation and the practical need for rest. The soft murmur of women's voices sharing their experiences by lamplight created bonds that transcended the official beliefs about contamination and danger. In ancient Egypt, the goddess Isis was said to have given women their monthly cycles as a gift, connecting them to the creative forces of the universe. The gentle lapping of Nile waters against temple steps seemed to echo the monthly rhythms that connected earthly women to divine mysteries. Here, at least, the monthly cycle was seen as sacred rather than contaminating, powerful rather than shameful. As you let these images fade softly into the edge of sleep, consider the countless women throughout history who navigated these beliefs with grace and ingenuity. They found ways to maintain their dignity and continue their essential work while accommodating societies that saw their natural biological processes as alternately dangerous and mystical, contaminating and sacred. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, let the ancient fears and mysteries dissolve into simple biological truth, as natural and unremarkable as breathing, as worthy of respect and care as any other aspect of human health and well-being.
Allow your mind to wander now into the shadowy realm between the sacred and the profane, where ancient peoples struggled to understand women's relationship with the divine and the mysterious. In their worldview, women existed at a peculiar crossroads, simultaneously closer to spiritual forces than men, yet more susceptible to corruption by those same powers. They were potential saints and suspected witches, often in the same breath. Picture the soft glow of oil lamps illuminating the oracle at Delphi in ancient Greece, where the Pythia, always a woman, sat upon her sacred tripod, breathing in the sweet vapors that supposedly carried divine messages. The ancient Greeks, who questioned women's rational capabilities in philosophy and politics, nevertheless believed that the gods spoke most clearly through feminine voices. Apollo himself, the god of reason and logic, chose women as his primary messengers to humanity. This wasn't considered contradictory by the ancients. It made perfect sense within their understanding of cosmic balance. Women, being less rational and more emotional in their view, were simply more open to divine influence. Their minds, uncluttered by masculine logic, could serve as clearer channels for supernatural communication. The gentle echoes of prophecy spoken in the sacred caves of Delphi were understood as divine truth precisely because they came through feminine consciousness,
which was seen as more permeable to otherworldly forces. Roman culture inherited and expanded upon these beliefs with characteristic systematization. The Vestal virgins held positions of enormous religious authority, tending the sacred flame that symbolized the heart of Roman civilization. Yet this spiritual power came with extraordinary restrictions. They had to remain celibate, their lives carefully regulated, their very bodies considered too sacred for normal human relationships. The soft footsteps of these priestesses on marble temple floors carried the weight of imperial spiritual well-being, even as the same society that honored them restricted their basic human freedoms. But here's where the ancient understanding becomes particularly complex and fascinating. The same spiritual sensitivity that made women ideal oracles and priestesses was also seen as making them vulnerable to malevolent supernatural influences. If divine forces could enter feminine consciousness more easily, so too could demonic ones. This belief laid the groundwork for centuries of suspicion about women's involvement with dark magic and sorcery. Early Christian thinkers inherited these classical ideas and gave them distinctly theological interpretations. The story of Eve's susceptibility to the serpent's temptation became the archetypal example of feminine vulnerability to spiritual corruption. Augustine, writing by candlelight in his North African monastery, developed elaborate theories about women's heightened spiritual sensitivity, making them simultaneously more capable of holiness and more prone to spiritual danger. The gentle scratch of his quill preserved ideas that would shape Christian attitudes toward women for over a millennium. Medieval Islamic scholars developed parallel concepts within their own theological framework. Women were seen as possessing a kind of spiritual intuition that men lacked, making them excellent preservers of religious tradition and family spiritual practices. Yet this same sensitivity was thought to make them more susceptible to jinn and other supernatural influences. The soft call to prayer, echoing across medieval Baghdad, reached women who were understood to exist in a more spiritually charged reality than their male neighbors. The development of Christian mysticism in medieval Europe created fascinating complications within these beliefs. Female mystics like Hildegard of Bingen and Julian of Norwich claimed direct divine revelations, writing theological works of sophisticated beauty and complexity. Yet church authorities struggled with how to authenticate these experiences. Were these genuine divine communications, or were these women being deceived by demonic forces that exploited their supposedly vulnerable feminine nature? The solution they developed reveals the beautiful complexity of medieval spiritual thinking. Genuine female mystical experience was authenticated through a combination of theological orthodoxy, observable holiness of life, and often supernatural signs like stigmata or miraculous healings. The gentle rustling of pages in monastery libraries preserved careful theological analyses that tried to distinguish between divine and demonic feminine spiritual experiences, creating elaborate criteria that acknowledged women's spiritual gifts while maintaining clerical control over their interpretation. This theological framework had profound practical implications. Women who claimed spiritual experiences that aligned with church teaching might be venerated as saints. Those whose experiences challenged orthodox authority or who lived outside acceptable social boundaries might find themselves accused of witchcraft. The difference between saint and sorceress often depended more on social context and ecclesiastical politics than on the nature of the spiritual experiences themselves.
The witch trials that swept through Europe and colonial America represent perhaps the darkest flowering of these ancient beliefs about women's spiritual vulnerability. The soft crack of burning wood in countless town squares reflected a terrible consensus that women's spiritual sensitivity, left uncontrolled by proper masculine authority, would inevitably lead to corruption and evil. The Malleus Maleficarum, the infamous hammer of witches, systematized these fears into a comprehensive manual for identifying and prosecuting spiritual corruption in feminine form. Yet, even during these dark periods, the positive aspects of beliefs about women's spiritual nature persisted. Convents became centers of learning and spiritual creation, where women could pursue intellectual and spiritual lives impossible in secular society. The gentle chanting of nuns at dawn prayers represented an officially sanctioned form of feminine spiritual authority, operating within carefully controlled boundaries, but nonetheless real and respected. Folk traditions across cultures developed their own nuanced understandings of women's spiritual roles. The wise woman, or curandera, might be simultaneously feared and sought after. Her knowledge of herbs and healing seen as bordering on the supernatural, but nonetheless essential to community well-being. The gentle whisper of incantations over sick children, the careful preparation of herbal remedies, the preservation of ancient healing traditions. All of it existed in the liminal space between accepted spirituality and suspected witchcraft. What strikes me as most remarkable about these ancient beliefs is how they simultaneously elevated and constrained women's spiritual lives. To be seen as naturally closer to divine forces might seem like an honor, but it came with the constant suspicion that this same proximity made women inherently dangerous and unreliable. Their spiritual gifts were acknowledged, but required careful masculine supervision to remain pure and beneficial. As you settle into the quiet moments before sleep, imagine those long-ago women navigating this complex spiritual landscape, the oracle breathing sacred vapors and speaking divine truth, the abbess leading her community in prayer, the village healer gathering herbs by moonlight, the accused witch maintaining her innocence before hostile judges. All of them lived at the intersection of the sacred and the suspect, their spiritual lives both honored and feared by the societies that shaped them. The soft echo of ancient prayers, the gentle flame of votive candles, the whispered wisdom passed from grandmother to granddaughter, all of it speaks to the persistent human recognition that the divine and the mysterious often seem to speak through feminine voices, even when those same societies struggled to trust what they were hearing. Let yourself drift now into the strange contradictions of how ancient peoples understood women's physical nature, beliefs that painted them simultaneously as delicate creatures requiring protection and as sturdy beasts capable of endless labor. These weren't opposing views held by different cultures, but often simultaneous beliefs within the same societies, creating a fascinating puzzle of expectations that women somehow had to navigate with grace. Picture the soft morning light filtering through the windows of an ancient Greek gymnasium, where young men train their bodies for athletic competition while their sisters remain at home, believed to be too physically delicate for such exertions. Yet walk through the countryside at the same hour, and you'll find those same delicate women hauling water from wells, grinding grain by hand, and working in fields from dawn to dusk. The disconnect wasn't lost on ancient observers, but somehow it never quite challenged the underlying assumptions about feminine physical nature. Aristotle, walking slowly through his garden as he contemplated human biology, wrote extensively about women's physical limitations. In his understanding, women were naturally colder and moister in constitution, making them weaker, more prone to illness, and fundamentally less capable of the physical and mental exertion that characterized masculine virtue. The olive trees swaying gently overhead provided shade for thoughts that would influence Western medicine for centuries, despite being contradicted by daily observation of women's actual physical capabilities. Roman physicians expanded upon these theories with characteristic thoroughness. Galen, writing by oil lamplight in his 2nd century study, developed elaborate explanations for women's supposed physical inferiority. They had smaller hearts, he claimed, which meant less life force flowing through their bodies. Their muscles were softer, their bones more brittle, their overall constitution fundamentally different and inferior to the masculine ideal. Yet the same Roman society that endorsed these medical theories relied entirely on women's physical labor for everything from textile production to food preparation to child care. The contradiction was perhaps most stark in the realm of childbirth. Ancient societies recognized that women regularly survived an experience that would kill most men, the trauma of giving birth, often repeatedly, usually without significant medical intervention. Yet somehow, this evidence of extraordinary physical resilience was interpreted not as proof of women's strength, but as confirmation of their animal-like nature. They could endure childbirth, the reasoning went, because they were closer to beasts than to the refined masculine ideal. Medieval European thinking inherited these classical contradictions and gave them distinctly Christian interpretations. The cult of courtly love elevated certain women to the status of delicate flowers requiring protection and veneration, while the same society worked peasant women to death in fields and workshops. The gentle strumming of lutes in castle courtyards celebrated feminine delicacy, while the sound of women's voices singing work songs echoed from every village, monastery, and manor house. Medieval medical texts reveal the fascinating complexity of these beliefs. Women were described as having wombs that could cause them to faint at the slightest provocation. Yet the same texts acknowledged that women regularly performed physically demanding tasks without apparent difficulty. The solution was to create separate categories. Aristocratic women were truly delicate and required protection, while working women were almost a different species, naturally suited to physical labor through their lower social status. Islamic medical traditions developed their own variations on these themes. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote extensively about women's constitutional weakness, while simultaneously acknowledging their essential role in physically demanding household management. The call to prayer, echoing across medieval Baghdad, reached societies that sequestered women to protect their supposed fragility, while relying on their labor to maintain family and community life.
What makes these beliefs particularly interesting is how they shaped the design of women's daily lives. Upper-class women in most ancient societies were discouraged from physical exercise or exertion, not because they were incapable, but because such activities were seen as inappropriate for their delicate constitutions. This created a self-fulfilling prophecy. Women who were prevented from developing physical strength naturally appeared more fragile than those who were required to work hard from childhood. The warrior queen traditions that existed in many ancient cultures created fascinating exceptions to these general beliefs. Figures like Boudica in Britain or Zenobia in Palmyra were celebrated for their physical courage and martial prowess, but they were typically understood as exceptional cases that proved rather than challenged the general rule of feminine fragility. The soft thunder of horses' hooves carrying these legendary women into battle seemed to echo from a different world than the one that produced theories about women's constitutional weakness. Ancient athletic traditions reveal another layer of contradiction. While Greek and Roman women were generally excluded from competitive athletics due to their supposed physical limitations, some religious festivals included women's races and physical competitions. The winners of these events demonstrated capabilities that should have challenged prevailing theories about feminine weakness, but somehow the evidence was compartmentalized rather than integrated into broader understanding. The practical skills women developed within their restricted spheres often required considerable physical strength and endurance. Spinning, weaving, food preparation, childcare, household management, all of these demanded muscular development, coordination, and stamina. Yet because these activities were categorized as domestic rather than athletic or martial, the physical capabilities they required were somehow invisible to the men who theorized about women's weakness. Perhaps most revealing are the ancient accounts of women in extreme circumstances, sieges, famines, migrations, where the normal social restrictions broke down and women's actual physical capabilities became visible. During the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, Josephus records women fighting alongside men with desperate courage. The soft whisper of arrows in flight carried death from feminine hands just as surely as from masculine ones. Yet such accounts were treated as temporary aberrations rather than evidence of women's true capabilities. The economic realities of ancient life often contradicted the ideological beliefs about women's physical nature. Female slaves and servants were expected to perform back-breaking labor, while free women were celebrated for their delicacy. The same culture that produced poems about women's lily-white hands also relied on those hands to knead bread, scrub floors, and haul water. The contradiction was so obvious that it required constant mental gymnastics to maintain. As you settle into the peaceful moments before sleep, imagine those ancient women navigating this impossible maze of expectations, delicate enough to require protection, yet strong enough to bear and raise children, manage households, and perform endless physical labor. They lived in bodies that were simultaneously celebrated as too precious for exertion, yet exploited as engines of endless work. The gentle rhythm of women's feet on ancient paths, carrying water jugs and grain baskets, the soft sound of their breathing as they worked through long days, the quiet strength that kept families and communities functioning despite being officially invisible, all of it speaks to the remarkable gap between ideology and reality that somehow persisted across cultures and centuries. Tonight, let those ancient restrictions and contradictions fade into the recognition of the simple truth that human strength comes in many forms, that physical capability has never been determined by gender, and that the women who came before us were every bit as capable, resilient, and strong as the theories of their time refused to acknowledge.
In these final moments of our gentle journey through ancient misconceptions about women, let your mind settle on perhaps the most fundamental and enduring of all the strange beliefs about women, the idea that they were not quite complete persons in their own right, but rather valuable property that required constant masculine oversight to function properly in the world. Close your eyes and imagine the soft morning light streaming into a Roman paterfamilias's study as he reviews his household accounts. Listed alongside his slaves, livestock, and furniture are his wife and daughters, not as separate legal entities, but as valuable possessions whose welfare and decisions were entirely his responsibility. This wasn't considered cruel or unusual, but simply the natural order of a well-managed household, as obvious to him as the arrangement of his furniture or the training of his horses. The legal concept of coverture, which spread throughout the ancient world and persisted well into the modern era, embodied this belief in systematic form. A woman's legal identity was covered by first her father's and then her husband's legal identity, much like a shadow is covered by the object that casts it. She could not own property, sign contracts, or represent herself in court any more than a child or a slave could. The soft scratch of stylus on wax tablets recorded legal arrangements that treated adult women as permanent minors, requiring masculine authorization for even basic decisions about their own lives. But here's what makes this belief particularly fascinating. It coexisted with the daily reality of women making complex decisions, managing significant resources, and exercising real authority within their households and communities. Roman women, despite their legal non-existence, were known to influence major political decisions through their relationships with powerful men. They managed estates, conducted business through male intermediaries, and accumulated wealth and influence that everyone acknowledged, even as the law pretended they didn't exist as independent agents. Ancient Hebrew law codified similar assumptions through the concept of ketubah and the bride price, treating marriage as essentially a property transfer from father to husband. Yet the same traditions preserved stories of women like Deborah and Esther, exercising independent judgment and leadership that saved entire nations. The gentle sound of scrolls being unrolled in ancient synagogues carried both the legal restrictions and the celebrated exceptions, somehow held together without apparent contradiction. Greek thinking provided philosophical justification for these practical arrangements through the concept of natural hierarchy. Aristotle argued that just as some people were natural slaves and others natural masters, women were natural subjects requiring masculine rule for their own welfare and that of society. In his understanding, a woman attempting to function independently was as unnatural and dangerous as a child trying to govern adults or a slave attempting to rule free citizens. The olive groves where he walked while developing these theories rustled with ideas that would justify legal and social subordination for centuries. The fascinating thing about ancient marriage customs is how they simultaneously celebrated women's value and denied their personhood. The elaborate rituals, expensive dowries, and careful negotiations around marriage arrangements all acknowledged women as precious and significant, but precious in the way that a valuable vase or a prize horse might be precious, important for what they could provide, rather than who they were as individuals. Ancient Egyptian civilization provides an interesting contrast that illuminates just how culturally constructed these beliefs were. Ancient Egyptian women enjoyed legal rights that would have been unthinkable in Greece or Rome. They could own property, initiate divorce, and represent themselves in legal proceedings. The gentle lapping of Nile waters against temple steps carried prayers from a society that recognized women's legal personhood, even as neighboring cultures found such ideas incomprehensible. Medieval European feudalism codified the property status of women through elaborate systems of guardianship and inheritance law. A woman might inherit vast estates and wield enormous economic power, but always under the legal fiction that she was exercising these rights on behalf of her male relatives, or under the protection of masculine authority. The soft candlelight that illuminated medieval legal documents recorded arrangements that gave women substantial practical power while denying them theoretical independence. The concept of women as prizes to be won appears throughout ancient literature and law, from Helen of Troy to the various contests where women were literally awarded to victorious men. These weren't necessarily loveless arrangements. Many ancient cultures celebrated romantic love and mutual affection within marriage, but the underlying structure treated women's consent as less important than masculine competition and authority. The winner of the contest gained not just the woman herself, but the honor and property she represented. Islamic law introduced interesting complexities to these patterns through concepts like mahar, dower, and women's property rights within marriage. Women could own and control property independently of their husbands in ways that Christian Europe wouldn't recognize for centuries. Yet they remained under masculine guardianship for many legal purposes. The call to prayer, echoing across medieval Islamic cities, reached societies that simultaneously honored women's economic rights and restricted their personal autonomy. What's most remarkable about these ancient beliefs is how they created elaborate justifications for what were essentially practical power arrangements. The idea that women were naturally suited to subordination, that they were happier and safer under masculine protection, that their minds were not equipped for independent decision-making. All of these theories served to make existing social structures seem inevitable and natural rather than constructed and changeable. The persistence of these beliefs across such different cultures and time periods suggests something important about how societies maintain stability through shared assumptions about natural order. When half of the population is defined as requiring supervision and protection rather than independence and authority, it creates a system that can seem mutually beneficial. Men gain authority and responsibility, women gain security and protection, even as it fundamentally limits human potential on both sides. Yet within these restrictive frameworks, women consistently found ways to exercise agency, influence decisions, and shape their communities. They worked through the systems available to them, building networks of support and influence that operated parallel to official power structures. The soft murmur of women's conversations in ancient markets, bathhouses, and religious gatherings carried real political and economic influence, even when that influence had to remain officially invisible. As our gentle journey through these ancient misconceptions comes to a close, let yourself rest in the knowledge that these beliefs, however persistent and widespread, were always incomplete pictures of human reality. The women who lived within these systems were never actually the property, prizes, or perpetual children that law and custom claimed them to be. They were complete human beings navigating incomplete social systems, finding ways to love, create, lead, and contribute within constraints that could limit but never fully contain the complexity of human personhood. The soft sounds of ancient daily life, women's laughter, their working songs, their whispered advice, and their gentle lullabies, all of it continues to echo through time, reminding us that the full humanity that official beliefs denied was always present, always real, always deserving of recognition and respect. May these memories of our ancestors, both their limitations and their persistence, guide you into peaceful dreams where the artificial boundaries of ancient misconceptions dissolve into the simple truth of human dignity and worth. The strange beliefs of the past fade now into the gentler understanding of the present, where all people can be recognized for who they truly are, rather than constrained by what others assume they must be. And so, dear friends, we reach the end of tonight's quiet journey through the curious beliefs of long ago times. As you drift off to sleep, carry with you not the weight of these ancient misconceptions, but rather a gentle appreciation for how far human understanding has traveled, and how much wisdom can be found in recognizing the difference between what people believed and what was actually true. If you found peace in this historical wandering, if these stories helped guide you toward restful sleep, let me know in the comments below, but only if it feels right. There's never any pressure here, just an invitation to share in this quiet community of people who find comfort in the strange, gentle lessons of history. Sweet dreams, friends. Until we meet again in another corner of the past, may your rest be deep and your dreams be filled with the quiet confidence that truth, however slowly, tends to emerge from even the most persistent misconceptions. Sleep well.